I woke up to the sound of gushing water, the kind that doesn't belong anywhere near my driveway. At first, I thought it was a busted sprinkler, but then I stepped outside and saw my front yard looking like a miniature version of Niagara Falls. A deep trench had been carved along my property line, and in it stood Karen, our HOA president, wearing gardening gloves like she was on some sort of archaeological dig. She was holding a hacksaw and beaming with the smug satisfaction of a woman who just found a new way to ruin someone's day. My main water line lay in two jagged pieces at her feet, the stream rushing out like it was in a hurry to escape this neighborhood as badly as I was. When I asked her what in God's name she thought she was doing, she pointed at me like a TV judge about to deliver a verdict. "You've been watering outside of HOA-approved hours," she said, as if this were some federal offense. I hadn't. I keep meticulous track of those ridiculous time slots just to avoid conversations like this. But Karen didn't care about facts, she cared about control. Cutting my water, apparently, was her idea of enforcing community standards. It was an absurd power play. The HOA bylaws said nothing about her taking it upon herself to physically interfere with someone's utility service, but she acted like this was her God-given right. And while I stood there, stunned and dripping from the spray, she actually had the audacity to pull out her phone and snap a picture of the mess she'd made. "For documentation," she said. I could have screamed, called the cops, or threatened legal action right there. But that's not my style. Losing my temper would have been exactly what she wanted, a public display of me as the aggressive homeowner in front of the neighborhood. So I took a deep breath, nodded slowly, and told her in the calmest voice I could muster, "All right, Karen. Have it your way." The smirk she gave me as she marched off with her gloves still on told me she thought she'd won. What she didn't know was that her little stunt had just given me the perfect opening to set something much, much bigger in motion. I didn't just want my water back. I wanted the kind of revenge that wouldn't just stop her from pulling this on me again. It would make sure she could never pull it on anyone. The next call I made wasn't to the HOA board, or to the police, or even to a lawyer. It was to an old friend from college, who now happened to work in acquisitions for a regional utility company. We hadn't spoken in a while, but I remembered from his Christmas cards that he loved a good grudge story, and this one had all the ingredients. I told him what had happened, and before I could even get to my idea, he started laughing. "You're thinking of buying them out, aren't you?" he said. I didn't have to answer. Karen thought cutting my water was her ultimate display of dominance. She had no idea she had just picked a fight with someone who was about to own the water she paid for every single month. And the best part? I wasn't going to lift a hacksaw or break a single bylaw to do it. I was going to play the long game, and when the moment came, it would be her standing in the yard, watching her world unravel, completely powerless to stop it. I spent the rest of that day calmly hauling bottled water into the house, making a show of waving to neighbors as if nothing was wrong. If Karen was watching from behind her curtains, and I knew she was, she'd think I was just being stubborn, refusing to admit she'd won. Meanwhile, I was pulling property records, mapping the utility's ownership boundaries, and finding every possible legal and financial loophole I could exploit. By the time the sun went down, I had three things: a temporary plan to live without my water line, a lead on who exactly controlled the local distribution system, and the name of the company that would happily sell it to me if the price was right. And thanks to Karen's little documentation photos, I also had enough evidence to turn her into the poster child for HOA overreach, if I decided to go public later. Karen thought she'd just cut my water. What she'd actually done was open the floodgates, and soon she was going to learn that some people don't just get even, they get ownership. By the next morning, Karen had escalated her little victory lap into a full-blown parade. I walked outside to grab the newspaper and found a printed HOA violation notice, taped to my front door in the most obnoxious shade of neon orange they could find. The notice claimed I was guilty of flagrant disregard for water use policies, and that my water service would remain disconnected until I paid a $500 HOA compliance fine plus restoration costs. It was pure theater. HOAs have no authority over municipal or private utility lines, but Karen clearly wanted to make it look official. I stood on my porch, coffee in hand, reading it with all the concern of someone looking at a coupon for expired yogurt. Karen had even signed it in that loopy, self-important cursive that tries to be elegant but ends up looking like a 7-year-old's attempt at calligraphy. A couple of my neighbors walked past during their morning jog, giving me awkward nods, probably wondering what kind of water crime I'd committed. The notice had done its job. Karen had framed me as a problem. I didn't bother tearing it down immediately. Instead, I let it hang there for the day, flapping in the breeze, because I knew Karen would swing by later to see me take it down in shame. In reality, I was working the phones. My old college friend, Ryan, had called me back that morning with the kind of news that makes you smile in public for no reason. The small utility company that handled our neighborhood's water distribution was owned by a larger regional provider, and that provider was quietly looking to sell off non-core assets to trim their portfolio. Translation: the neighborhood's water infrastructure was up for grabs to the right bidder. Buying a utility isn't like buying a used car. You can't just walk in with a check and drive away with the water main. But Ryan had the connections to get me in the right rooms. He'd already spoken to a broker, and the asking price was not small. It was the kind of number that would make most people hang up. But I wasn't most people, and I had some investment capital sitting in a portfolio that wasn't doing much besides aging politely. This wasn't just revenge. It was an investment in turning Karen into my unintentional tenant. That afternoon, I made my first chess move. I went to the HOA office, not because I needed to, but because I knew Karen would be there. The office was really just a glorified storage room in the community center with a folding table and a filing cabinet, but Karen sat behind it like she was chairing a Fortune 500 board meeting. I walked in, set a case of bottled water on the table, and smiled. "Thought I'd stop by to thank you for cutting my water," I said. "I've been drinking this stuff all day. It's crisp, refreshing. Honestly, I think you've improved my life." Karen's face twitched. She clearly wanted a reaction from me, some sign that I was suffering. Instead, I was giving her an infuriating kind of gratitude. "This isn't a joke," she said. "Until you comply with HOA policy, you will not have water service restored." I asked her, very politely, to show me the bylaw that gave the HOA authority to shut off a homeowner's utility service. She couldn't. She fumbled through a binder for a few seconds, muttering about general enforcement powers, then changed the subject. That was my cue to stand, thank her again, and leave. Every move from here on out was about control, and the less she felt she had over me, the more desperate she'd become. The next week was a balancing act. I had to live like a normal person without running water while also positioning myself as a completely unbothered neighbor. I installed a temporary rainwater collection barrel for non-drinking use, made a few showy trips to the grocery store for bottled water, and even joked to a couple of neighbors about embracing the minimalist lifestyle. Behind the scenes, Ryan and I were reviewing the utilities books, figuring out how to make the purchase look like a strategic infrastructure investment rather than a personal vendetta, which, of course, it also was. 2 weeks in, I got a text from Ryan. "We're in." The seller had accepted my offer, contingent on a final review. The paperwork would take another couple of weeks, but the deal was essentially done. In a matter of days, I'd owned the system that provided water to every home in our HOA, including Karen's. The timing couldn't have been better, because Karen had started to double down. She sent me another violation notice, this time threatening daily fines. She even made a passive-aggressive post in the HOA newsletter about certain residents who believe they are above community rules. My name wasn't mentioned, but my house was the only one in the entire neighborhood with a visible rainwater barrel, so subtlety wasn't exactly her strong suit. I kept my cool. If anything, I turned up the charm. I waved at her every time she drove by, offered to help her carry her groceries once, and even brought over a plate of cookies as a peace offering. She refused them, of course, but that just made it better. Every kindness I showed her made her more determined to win, and every move she made only set her up for the moment when I'd flip the board entirely. The closing date for the utility purchase was set for the first Monday of the following month. That Friday, I got one last surprise from Karen, an official-looking letter claiming the HOA would be contacting the water provider to ensure compliance with their policies. She had no clue that by the time she made that call, she'd be contacting me. The night before the deal closed, I sat on my porch with a glass of wine, watching the sprinklers on Karen's lawn sputter to life right on schedule. She was meticulous about watering times, always the first to point out when someone else wasn't. It hit me then. She really believed she was untouchable because she'd memorized the rules. She'd never considered what would happen if someone decided to change the rulebook entirely. By Monday morning, the ink was dry. The water company was mine. And now, for the first time since Karen had cut my line, I had a decision to make. How exactly to let her know she was now paying me every month for the privilege of turning on her tap. I decided not to tell Karen right away. The beauty of owning the water company was that I could choose exactly when and how to reveal it. There's no point in dropping a bomb if you can't enjoy watching it tick for a while. Besides, I needed to make sure everything was buttoned up legally before I made my move. Karen might be reckless, but I wasn't about to give her an inch of leverage. For the first week after the acquisition, I kept everything running as normal. Bills went out from the utilities' automated system, meters were read on schedule, and no changes were made to rates or service. On paper, nothing had changed at all. In reality, the entire lifeline of the HOA was in my hands, and no one, least of all Karen, knew it. That didn't mean Karen was letting up. If anything, she was getting bolder. I came home one afternoon to find a group of HOA board members standing in my driveway, clipboards in hand, inspecting the property. They claimed they were doing a compliance check, because I was refusing to restore service. I reminded them, calmly, that it wasn't my job to restore anything, and that their president had personally severed my water line. Their response was a series of awkward glances before they shuffled back toward the street, muttering something about just following up. That night, Ryan called with an idea. "If you really want to make an impact," he said, "don't go nuclear all at once. Turn it into a campaign. Make her feel the walls closing in before you actually drop the news." I liked the sound of that. I wanted Karen to feel the discomfort she had caused me, not in one big burst, but in slow, creeping increments she couldn't quite pin down. The next step was subtle, a small, across-the-board rate adjustment. Not enough to cause panic, but enough to make people notice their water bills had gone up. For most people, it was just a minor annoyance. But for someone like Karen, who prided herself on controlling every dollar in the HOA's budget, it would be a pebble in her shoe she couldn't ignore. Sure enough, within 3 days, I got my first indirect confirmation that she'd noticed. The HOA Facebook page lit up with her comments about inflated costs and the need to investigate the billing structure of our water provider. I even saw her suggesting the HOA negotiate directly with the company to secure better rates for members. The irony, of course, was delicious. She was preparing to go toe-to-toe with me and didn't even know it. While she was busy stirring up the board, I took care of my own repair. A licensed contractor came out to replace my cut water line, paid for, incidentally, by the HOA's insurance, thanks to the photos I'd provided showing Karen standing in the trench with the hacksaw. The crew had it done in a few hours, and I made sure to turn my sprinklers on for the first time in weeks that evening, just as Karen was driving past. I gave her a cheery wave as the spray caught the light like a rainbow. Her expression was a blend of confusion and suspicion, and I could almost see the gears turning in her head. A few days later, she finally confronted me. I was unloading groceries when she marched up my driveway, HOA binder under her arm, the same way she had the day she cut my line. "I need to know who your contact is at the water company," she said without preamble. "We're going to lodge a formal complaint about these rate increases." I leaned casually on the hood of my car. "Oh, I'm sure they'd love to hear from you," I said. "But you might want to make sure your tone is friendly. You know, just in case." That last bit was enough to make her squint at me like I'd just spoken in riddles. She demanded I give her a name and number. I smiled and told her I'd see what I could do, then went inside without another word. That weekend, I attended the monthly HOA meeting for the first time in months. I sat in the back, quietly sipping coffee, listening as Karen brought up the urgent issue of water rates. She launched into a long-winded speech about how the HOA should leverage its position as a large customer to negotiate better terms. It was like watching someone confidently walk into a room without realizing the floor was missing. When she proposed forming a rate negotiation committee, I raised my hand. "Wouldn't it make more sense," I said evenly, "to just deal directly with the person who owns the utility? You know, cut out the middleman?" There was a pause as people looked at each other, clearly wondering if I knew something they didn't. Karen, to her credit, tried to seize control of the moment. "That's exactly what we plan to do," she said, "once we have all the necessary information." The meeting wrapped without incident, but the seed had been planted. By the time I got home, Ryan had texted, "Ready to go public?" The truth was, I wasn't, at least, not yet. I wanted one more act in this play before the big reveal. The following week, I implemented a maintenance alert for the neighborhood's water supply. Nothing dramatic, just a scheduled 2-hour outage for system inspection. I picked a bright, sunny Saturday afternoon, the kind of time when people like Karen have their sprinklers running or are prepping for whatever overblown social gathering they've concocted. The notice went out to all customers. Standard procedure, but I knew who would take it personally. At exactly 2 p.m., the water shut off. I sat on my porch with a beer, listening for the moment when Karen would realize what was happening. It didn't take long. She came storming out of her house, phone in hand, barking orders to someone on the other end. A minute later, she was at my gate. "This outage is unacceptable," she shouted. The HOA had no warning. I pointed out that the notice had been sent 3 days ago. She waved it off. "We need to speak to the owner immediately." I looked her dead in the eye and said, "You are." It took her a second to process. The outrage in her face melted into shock, then into something I hadn't seen before: genuine uncertainty. What do you mean?" she asked, her voice quieter now. I took a sip of my beer and said, "It means that every drop of water you use, every shower you take, every sprinkler you run, you pay me for. So maybe think twice before you cut any more lines." She stared at me like she was trying to find a comeback, and couldn't. For the first time since I'd known her, Karen was silent. She turned on her heel and marched back to her house without another word. And I knew, in that moment, the real fun was just about to start. For the next few days, the neighborhood felt different. Not dramatically so, but there was a subtle shift in the air. Karen, who normally strutted around like she was running for queen of the cul-de-sac, was quieter. She still showed up at HOA functions and still posted her usual rule-heavy nonsense on the community Facebook page, but there was a hesitation in her tone now. It was as if every sentence she spoke carried a hidden calculation. Would this somehow end up costing her more on her next water bill? I didn't rush to twist the knife. I wanted her to stew in it, to have time for the realization to sink in that she wasn't in control anymore, that she had actually handed me the perfect weapon when she cut my line. This wasn't about shutting her water off or spiking her bill to some outrageous number. That would have been satisfying for a moment, but it would have also been obvious and reckless. My goal was subtler: to make her so paranoid about my control over her daily life that she'd start second-guessing every move she made. The first opportunity came sooner than I expected. I got a call from the utilities customer service team, technically still my employees now. that Karen had lodged a formal complaint about suspicious fluctuations in her water pressure. When they asked me how to handle it, I told them to send a technician for a full diagnostic, knowing it would involve a long afternoon of meter testing, pipe inspection, and politely reminding her that everything was operating within normal parameters. When the work order came back, I nearly laughed out loud. The technician's notes read, "Customer was present for entire inspection. Frequently questioned whether owner was targeting her personally. Requested we warn her if future bills would go up. Advised customer that rates are public record." In other words, she'd spent hours fishing for confirmation that I was out to get her. Of course, I was out to get her. But the beauty was, she couldn't prove it. The next HOA meeting rolled around, and I made a point of sitting in the front row this time. Karen kept darting glances at me during her president's report, clearly trying to gauge whether I was planning to pull another stunt like last time. I stayed completely silent through the first half of the meeting, letting her get comfortable. Then, just as she was wrapping up, I raised my hand. "Karen, I was wondering if the HOA has any plans to update the landscaping guidelines this season," I asked. She frowned, confused. "Why?" I smiled. "Because with water rates changing in response to supply demands, it might be worth considering drought-resistant plants. You know, to help homeowners manage costs." The silence in the room was golden. Everyone knew exactly who I was talking about without me having to say it. Karen's jaw tightened, but she had to nod along, pretending to be on board with cost-saving initiatives. I could see it in her eyes, though. She knew I'd just painted a giant target on her lush, perfectly green lawn. 2 weeks later, the next subtle move went into effect. I introduced a small seasonal, high-demand surcharge for properties using above-average amounts of water. It was a fair policy. It applied to everyone equally. But Karen's property, with its expansive lawn, flower beds, and decorative fountain, practically guaranteed she'd land in the top bracket. And she did. The day the bills went out, I spotted her pacing on her porch, phone glued to her ear. That evening, she cornered me in my driveway. "This surcharge is outrageous," she snapped. I shrugged. "It's a market adjustment. Everyone's paying it." She narrowed her eyes. "You know exactly what you're doing." I met her glare with a calm smile. "Yes, I do. It's called running a business." The cracks in her armor were starting to show. Her usual smug certainty was gone, replaced by sharp bursts of frustration she couldn't quite keep under wraps. She'd underestimated me from the start, thinking I'd be just another homeowner she could intimidate into submission. Now she was realizing she'd set the stage for her own downfall, and she couldn't find a way off it. Then came the perfect storm. The utility was due for a round of infrastructure upgrades. New meters, pressure regulators, the works. Normally, this would be routine maintenance spread evenly across the service area. But as the owner, I could approve the schedule, which meant I could place Karen's property dead last in the lineup. It was all perfectly legitimate. Her system would still be serviced within the legal maintenance window, but until then, she'd be stuck with an outdated regulator prone to occasional drops in pressure. Nothing dangerous, nothing she could sue over, just enough to make every shower, every sprinkler cycle, just slightly less satisfying. The first time it happened, I happened to be outside trimming a hedge. Karen came stomping over, hair wet, wearing a robe like she'd just been yanked out of a spa treatment gone wrong. "My water pressure just dropped to nothing in the middle of my shower," she barked. I gave her my best customer service voice. "I'm so sorry to hear that. The system's due for upgrades soon. You're on the list." Her face reddened. "Move me up on the list." I shook my head. "I can't play favorites, Karen. That wouldn't be fair to everyone else." For a second, I thought she might actually explode right there on the driveway. Instead, she spun on her heel and stormed off, muttering under her breath. Over the next month, the game became almost too easy. Every HOA bulletin about water conservation, every neighbor who mentioned a rate increase, every time she saw me chatting with someone from the community, Each little thing chipped away at her control. She was still technically the HOA president, but the title had lost its weight. People were starting to see her less as a leader and more as a loudmouth who'd picked the wrong fight. The real tipping point came when she tried to push through a new HOA policy requiring all homeowners to get approval for exterior water features. She dressed it up as a beautification measure, but it was obvious to everyone she was targeting me, hoping to ban my rainwater collection barrel. What she didn't expect was for me to stand up in the middle of the meeting and say, "If we're going to start policing water use like this, maybe it's time we renegotiate the HOA's own service agreement with the water provider." The room went quiet. Half the people there knew I was the water provider. The other half would know by the end of the night. Karen froze, realizing she'd just walked into another trap. I didn't even need to push further. The whispers started, people exchanged looks, and by the time the meeting ended, Karen's little ordinance was dead in the water. Figuratively, for now. Because the truth was, I wasn't done. Not even close. I'd been patient, methodical, and careful. But the final act was coming, and when it hit, it wouldn't just humiliate her in front of the neighborhood, it would strip her of the one thing she valued more than control, her title as HOA president. And I had the perfect way to make it happen. The idea came to me while I was reviewing the utility company's annual community outreach budget. Every year, they set aside a small fund for customer engagement and goodwill projects, basically PR stunts disguised as community improvement. Normally, it went toward things like donating bottled water during heat waves or sponsoring Little League teams. But this year, I had the authority to redirect it anywhere I wanted. And I knew exactly where. If Karen's power came from the HOA board, then the fastest way to cut her off at the knees was to take away her credibility with the very people who kept her in office. And the way to do that wasn't by fighting her directly, it was by making her look like the obstacle to something everyone else wanted. I proposed a project called the Neighborhood WaterSmart Initiative. Free installation of modern irrigation systems, low-flow showerheads, and drought-resistant landscaping for any homeowner who opted in. It was pitched as an environmental upgrade, but the real hook was that it came with a permanent discount on water rates for participants. The fine print was simple. The program required property access for installation, and the schedule would be handled by my company, not the HOA. I made sure the announcement went out in glossy flyers, in everyone's mailbox, with my company's name on the header and my direct contact number at the bottom. The offer was generous enough that no sane homeowner would refuse it, except, of course, someone like Karen, who hated the idea of anything bypassing her authority. Sure enough, within 24 hours, she was on the community Facebook page warning people to be cautious about unsanctioned projects that could conflict with HOA standards. A few residents commented asking what she meant, and she doubled down, claiming that the HOA had final say over any exterior work done on homes. The problem for her was, I'd already cleared the project with the county, and the HOA had zero legal jurisdiction to block it. The pushback started almost immediately. Neighbors who'd been lukewarm on me before were suddenly eager to sign up. After all, who doesn't want lower bills and a prettier yard at someone else's expense? The first installations began that week, and by design, I made sure Karen's next-door neighbor was one of the first to get a full upgrade. I'll never forget standing across the street, sipping coffee, watching crews tear out his patchy grass and replace it with a sleek, water-efficient landscape while Karen paced on her porch, arms crossed so tight they looked like they might fuse together. She marched over to the crew at one point, demanding to know who authorized the work, and they simply pointed at me. The look on her face when she realized she couldn't stop it was pure gold. By the second week, half the neighborhood had signed up. Karen was now in a bizarre position where the majority of the people she represented were openly praising me for improving the community, while side-eyeing her for trying to block it. She called an emergency HOA meeting to address what she referred to as unauthorized corporate intrusion into HOA governance. I made sure to attend, sitting front and center this time. The meeting was a train wreck for her from the start. She opened with a rant about protecting property values, but within minutes, homeowners were pushing back, asking why she'd oppose a program that saved them hundreds of dollars a year. One guy even stood up and said, "Karen, this is the first time anyone's done something useful around here in years, and you're mad because you didn't get to approve it?" The murmurs of agreement around the room were music to my ears. I let it play out for a while, then stood and addressed the group. "For the record," I said, "the program is fully compliant with local regulations, requires no HOA approval, and is open to every homeowner, including the HOA president." Then I turned to Karen with a perfectly pleasant smile. Of course, if she prefers to pay more for water, that's entirely her choice. The laughter that rippled through the room wasn't cruel, it was worse for her. It was the kind of light, dismissive laugh people give when they've stopped taking someone seriously. And in politics, even small-time HOA politics, that's the kiss of death. Over the next month, Karen's grip on the neighborhood eroded fast. The Water Smart initiative became a kind of unspoken referendum on her leadership. Every new yard that got an upgrade was another house visibly siding with me. By the time the quarterly HOA elections rolled around, she'd gone from unchallenged incumbent to scrambling for support. I didn't even have to run against her myself. A younger neighbor named Lisa, sharp, level-headed, and well-liked, threw her hat in the ring. She made no secret of her support for my project, and her campaign boiled down to a simple message: let's work with people who are helping us instead of fighting them. I stayed publicly neutral, but privately, I made sure every homeowner who called my office about the water program left with a reminder of the upcoming election date. Election night was almost anticlimactic. The votes weren't even close. Lisa won by a landslide, and Karen's name might as well have been written in invisible ink. She didn't storm out or make a scene, she just sat there, stiff as a statue, while Lisa took the oath as the new HOA president. The next day, Karen's sprinklers were running at 7 a.m., in violation of her own beloved watering schedule rules. I don't know if it was an accident or a small act of defiance, but I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. She was just another customer now, with no authority, no clipboard, and no say over how I ran my business. A week later, I sent her the same water bill as everyone else. No surcharges, no penalties, just the standard rate. I wanted her to know that I wasn't vindictive for the sake of it. What I'd done to her had a purpose, and now that the lesson was learned, there was no need to keep pressing. I'd like to say that was the end of it, that she quietly faded into the background and life in the neighborhood went back to normal. And in some ways it did. People stopped worrying about arbitrary fines and ridiculous inspections. The HOA meetings became shorter and friendlier. The tension that had hung over the community for years seemed to evaporate. As for Karen, she still lives 2 streets over. We see each other now and then, at the mailbox at the grocery store, and she gives me a curt nod but never starts a conversation. I think she knows that as much as she hates me, she owes me for one thing. I didn't just end her reign. I ended the idea that anyone like her could hold that kind of power here again. The best part? Every month, without fail, she still writes a check to my company. And every time I see her name on the payment list, I remember that morning she stood in my yard, hacksaw in hand, thinking she'd taught me a lesson. She did, but not the one she intended. Because if there's one thing Karen understands now, it's this. In this neighborhood, the water doesn't flow without me. And it never will again.